J.W. Williams Funeral Directors have been proudly serving the people of this community since 1918. Service is our motto. The poor, the rich, the middle class and all are given the best of care and attention at all times. You have the privilege to select what you want. In your time of need, contact the capable, the competent, and the dependable staff of the J.W. Williams Funeral Home who is genuinely concerned with your care. At J.W. Williams Funeral Home, you are aptly served by the proprietor president, Deacon Arthur L. Parker, who continues the traditions and values set forth by the past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams. Your announcers for the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Sunday morning program are Deacon Arthur L. Parker, Reverend Isaac Alondra Wilkerson Parker, Minister Frankie Harmon, Miss Sandra Johnson, and Deacon Earl Clark, Jr.
Thank you, and good morning, friends. We come to you this morning to bring announcements, dedications, and songs. We certainly hope that your day may be brighter after listening to our program. The family of Mr. Jaquarian Marquez Hunt of McDonald, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Fannie Mae Maynard Harvey of Warner Robins, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for the food, the flowers, the condolences, and all other expressions of sympathy and kindness shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. Mr. Jaquarian Marquez Hunt, age 21, of 1133 Eagles Landing Parkway, McDonald, Georgia, died Wednesday, November 2nd, at the Piedmont Henry County Hospital in Stockbridge, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Jaquarian Marquez Hunt, age 21, was held Saturday, November 12th, at the A.S. Clark Auditorium on the campus of the M.D. White's Medical Institute in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Isaac H. Owens, pastor of the Mount Calvary Baptist Church, officiated. The burial followed at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted parents, Mrs. Montoya Westbrook and her husband, Mr. Broderick Westbrook of McDonald, Georgia, and Mr. Antonio G. Addy Sr. and his wife, Mrs. Teresa P. Addy of Vienna, Georgia. His loving and caring sibling, Mr. Antonio G. Addy Jr. and Mr. Antonio G. Addy III, both of Perry, Georgia, Miss Amaya Addy, Mr. Jalen Addy, and Mr. Jordan Addy, all of Warner Robins, Georgia. Ms. Brianna Westbrook, Mr. Broderick Westbrook Jr., Mr. Borden Westbrook, all of McDonald, Georgia. Miss Antonia Addy and Miss Periana Smith, Mrs. Ariana Smith, all of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Vincent Gaston of Vienna, Georgia. His loving grandmother, Mrs. Leela Westbrook of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved aunts and uncles, Miss Rotunda Harmon, Miss Melissa Harmon, Miss Olympia Lofton and her husband, Mr. Adrian Lofton, Mr. Donald Addy, Mr. Castoria Addy, Miss Centoria Hunt, all of Cordele, Georgia, Miss Akeisha Hunt of California, Miss Latoya Glover of Arabi, Georgia, Miss Tanisha Glover of Rochelle, Georgia, Mrs. Brenda Cross and her husband, Mr. Richard Cross, Mr. Eric Hunt, Mr. Quentin Hunt, Mrs. Sarah Johnson and her husband, Mr. Michael Johnson, and Mr. Johnny B. Johnson and his wife, Mrs. Juanita Johnson, all of Cordele, Georgia. Mrs. Shalonda Gaines and her husband, Mr. Michael Gaines of Vienna, Georgia. Mr. Nicky Westbrook and his wife, Mrs. Nicole Westbrook of Warner Robins, Georgia. Mrs. Rosa McCumrick and her husband, Mr. Neil McCumrick of Rochelle, Georgia. Mrs. Mary Lee Green and her husband, Mr. Lester Green. And Mrs. Diane Lewis and her husband, Mr. Jerry Lewis, both of Ashburn, Georgia. Mr. Tim Napper of Atlanta, Georgia, a host of beloved cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends to include a multitude of racing friends survive Mr. Jacarian Marquez Hunt, age 21, of 1133 Eagles Landing Parkway, McDonald, Georgia. Mrs. Fannie Mae Maynard Harvey, age 76, of 301 Millside Drive, Warner Robins, Georgia, died Sunday, November 6th at the Houston Medical Center in Warner Robins, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Fannie Mae Maynard Harvey, age 76, was held Saturday, November 12th, at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Portico in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Ivory J. Corbin officiated. The eulogy was delivered by her beloved and devoted brother, the Reverend Nelson Maynard, pastor of the Crossroad Baptist Church and the St. James Baptist Church. The burial followed at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted mother, Mother May Frances Maynard of Warner Robins, Georgia. Her loving and devoted children, Mr. Charles Harris and his wife, Mrs. Tanika Harris of Arabi, Georgia. Mr. Stanley Harvey and his wife, Mrs. Tammy Harvey of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Toby Harris and his wife, Mrs. Cynthia Harris of Warner Robins, Georgia. Mr. Jimmy Collins and his wife, Mrs. LaWanda Collins of Cordele, Georgia. Miss Patricia Collins and her husband, Mr. Alvin Collins, and Miss Charlene Collins, both of Pennsylvania. 21 beloved grandchildren, 19 great-grandchildren, her beloved sisters, Mrs. Marilyn Maynard, Mrs. Eddie Jean Brown and her husband, Mr. Johnny Brown, both of Cordele, Georgia, and Miss Sarah Ann White of Warner Robins, Georgia. Her beloved brothers, the Reverend Nelson Maynard and his wife, Mrs. Melinda Maynard, Mr. Samuel Maynard, and Mr. Joe Maynard, all of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Benny Maynard and his wife, Mrs. Brenda Maynard, and Mr. Ernest Maynard and his wife, Mrs. Lorraine Maynard of Albany, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends to include Miss Maybelle Menu, Miss Wanakee Doster, Mr. Columbus Johnson, Miss Lillian Gray, Mr. David Gray, and Mr. Nathaniel Gray, all of Cordele, Georgia. Mrs. Kendra Pewitt and her husband, Mr. Greg Pewitt of Hawkinsville, Georgia, and Miss Latacia Harvey of Vienna, Georgia. Ms. Hicks, Mrs. Eddie Mae Gaston, and Miss Joanne Glenn all survived. Mrs. Fannie Mae Maynard Harvey, age 76, of 301 Millside Drive, Warner Robins, Georgia. Again, the family of Mr. Jacquerian Marquez Hunt of McDonald, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Fannie Mae Maynard Harvey of Warner Robins, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for all of the many kindnesses shown to them during the hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. May God bless each of you is their prayer. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors serving Cordele and Vienna were in charge of each of these arrangements during the past week. And now, it is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcement. Mrs. Janice Patrick Hardison, age 61, of 908 South 8th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, November 9th at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted mother, Mother Ida Bell Patrick of Cordele, Georgia. Her loving and devoted children, Mr. DeVasco Barker and his wife, Mrs. Shanteria Barker of Warner Robins, Georgia, and Mrs. Brianna Jones and her husband, Mr. Donzel Jones of Cordele, Georgia. Two beloved grandchildren, her loving and devoted sisters, Mrs. Annie Corbin of Fort Valley, Georgia, Miss Rita Patrick Bass of Cordele, Georgia, Miss Gwendolyn Luster and her husband, Mr. Vonnie Luster of Lakeland, Florida, and Miss Gail Staley of Cordele, Georgia. Her beloved brothers, Mr. Leonard Patrick and his wife, Mrs. Loretta Patrick, and Deacon Reginald Patrick and his wife, Mrs. Lucretia Patrick, both of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Benny Martin of Texas. Her beloved mother-in-law is Estella Ray of Atlanta, Georgia. Her sister-in-law, Mrs. Harriet Walker of Atlanta, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends to include her pearl sisters, Miss Lavetta Fields, Mrs. Deborah Cobb, survived Mrs. Janice Patrick Hardison, age 61, of 908 South 8th Street, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Janice Patrick Hardison, age 61, will be held today, Sunday, November 13th, at 10 a.m. at the A.S. Clark Auditorium on the M.D. White's Medical Campus in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Christopher R. Douglas will officiate. The burial will follow at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Gloria Patrick Hughes, age 69, of Griffin, Georgia, died Sunday, November 6th, at the Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Survivors include her three loving and devoted children, Miss Vigia Barner of Griffin, Georgia, Miss Pamela Barner, and Mr. Jerry Barner Jr. and his wife, Mrs. Shavetta Barner, both of Cordele, Georgia. 6 loving grandchildren, 5 great-grandchildren, her loving and devoted mother, Deacon S. Maddie May Patrick of Cordele, Georgia. 6 loving and devoted siblings, Deacon J.C. Patrick Jr. and his wife, Mrs. Sheila Patrick, Mr. Alfred Patrick Sr. and his wife, Mrs. Patricia Patrick, and Mrs. Margaret Mobley and her husband, Mr. Walter Mobley, all of Cordele, Georgia. Mrs. Gwendolyn Dent and her husband, Mr. Michael Dent of Atlanta, Georgia. Mrs. Deborah Sims and her husband, Mr. Charles Sims, of Forest Park, Georgia. And Deacon Obie Patrick and his wife, Mrs. Angela Patrick of Douglasville, Georgia. Her sister, cousin, Miss Joyce Hall of Cordele, Georgia. 2 beloved aunts, Mrs. Jessie Mae Colson of Cordele, Georgia, and Miss Rose Jones of Miami, Florida. A beloved god sister, Mrs. Fane River Dove. A god brother, Deacon Johnny Wilson. A host of beloved nieces, nephews, cousins, extended families to include the Stembridge family, the Redding family, the Wilson family, Miss Glendoria Talbert, Miss Brenda Dent Redding, Miss Maydie Clark, and Miss Rosa West. Her beloved church family, the Gethsemane Missionary Baptist Church. Her many sorrowing friends survive Miss Gloria Patrick Hughes, age 69, of Griffin, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Gloria Patrick Hughes, age 69, will be held today, Sunday, November 13th, at 1 p.m. at the A.S. Clark Auditorium on the campus of the M.D. Whiteys Medical Institute in Cordele, Georgia. Her pastor, the Reverend Cecil Strouder, pastor of the Gethsemane Baptist Church, will officiate. Her beloved cousin, the Reverend Kenneth Took Sr., will deliver the eulogy. The burial will follow at the Sunnyside Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. United States Army veteran, Mr. Elias Sims III, age 69, of 601 Eastview Drive, Americus, Georgia, died early this morning, Sunday, November 13, at the Columbus Hospice in Forsyth, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Miss Kamisha A. Sims and Mr. Elias Sims IV, a host of other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. United States Army veteran, Mr. Elias Sims III, age 69, of 601 Eastview Drive, Americus, Georgia. The funeral service for United States Army veteran, Mr. Elias Sims III, age 69, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. The J. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors, serving Cordele and Diana, are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Friends, that conclude our funeral notices for this morning. As always, we do remind you concerning our pre-funeral arrangements planning available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home, with packages available with a single pay, a 3-year pay, and a 5-year pay. So please stop by and talk with us concerning your pre-funeral arrangements needs available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. And also whole life insurance is available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home.
public on Saturday, November 19th at 11 o'clock a.m. This will be a drive-through outreach. Brother Cecil Schwaller is the pastor. Again, the Gethsemane Baptist Church will be serving Thanksgiving dinners to the public on Saturday, November the 19th at 11 o'clock a.m. This will be a drive-through outreach. Brother Cecil Schwaller is the pastor. Wilcox Head Start is offering free child development services for eligible families with children ages 3 to 5. For more information, please contact Mrs. Donna Jenkins at 229-365-2341 or 478-922-4464. The New Mount Zion First Baptist Church of Ashburn, Georgia, will be celebrating their church's 132nd church anniversary on Wednesday, November 17th through Thursday, November 18th at 7 o'clock p.m. nightly. The guest minister for Wednesday will be Reverend Dr. Frankie Harmon, pastor of the New St. Stephen's Church of Cordele. The guest minister for Thursday, November 18th, will be Elder Larry Coffey, pastor of Church of God by Faith, Ashburn, Georgia. The anniversary will climax on Sunday, November 20th at 11 o'clock a.m. All are invited to attend. The Cordial Christ chapter of the NAACP will not have its regular monthly meeting this afternoon. The meeting will be rescheduled for a later date. Dr. Ruby Jackson is the branch secretary. Reverend Isaac H. Owens is the pastor. Again, as we continue to remind you of our vaccination and things that are taking place with the spread of our flu and COVID, we ask that you will take in consideration, if you have not been vaccinated, to please do so as well. One other announcement I would like to make, I would like to congratulate Mrs. Linda Gale Rollins on her retirement. She was honored with a retirement celebration on last evening for 43 years of dedicated service to the state of Georgia, to the Department of Family and Children's Services of this area. We congratulate her and we say best wishes as she enters into the next phase of being retired. We thank her for the work that she has done for our community over the last 43 years. And also, I'd like to say congratulations and happy 30th wedding anniversary to my wife, Minister Kathleen Owens, as we will be celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary on tomorrow. May God bless our union and keep it strong. That will conclude our announcements for this morning.
And now for dedication. Our first selection this morning is dedicated to the following. In loving memory of the Reverend Nathaniel Jackson Sr. and Mother Mary Jackson, who would have celebrated their 78th birthday, 78th anniversary on November the 14th. Dedication requested by their beloved family members, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of the Reverend Nathaniel Jackson Sr. and Mother Mary Jackson, who would have celebrated their wedding anniversary, 78th wedding anniversary on November the 14th. In loving memory of Deacon Timmy Felton Sr., who departed this life November 8th, 1997, dedication requested by his beloved children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Miss Daphne Armstrong, who would have celebrated her birthday November 9th, dedication requested by the Armstrong family. Precious memory lingers still. In loving memory of Mrs. Bernetta Simmons, who departed this life November 10th, 2017. Dedication requested by the Williams and Simmons family, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Mother Mary and Mother Frances Williams, who would have celebrated her birthday November 10th. Dedication requested by the Williams family. Precious memory lingers still. In loving memory of Mr. Willie Jr. Davis, who would have celebrated his birthday November 11th. Dedication requested by Mrs. Mary Frances Davis and the entire family, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Mr. Willie C. Barrett, who departed this life November 11th, 2021. Dedication requested by the Barrett family, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Mrs. Ora Lee Adams, who departed this life November 11th, 1991. Dedication requested by the Adams and Manning family. Precious memory lingers still. Mrs. Ora Lee Adams, our auntie, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Miss Frederica Renee Lewis, who departed this life November 11th, 2013. Dedication requested by her twin brother, Mr. Frederick Lewis, and the entire family. Precious memory lingers still. In loving memory of Mrs. Durnell Armstrong, who departed this life November 14, 1971. Dedication requested by the entire Armstrong family, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Deacon Eddie Mathis, who would have celebrated his birthday November 15, dedication requested by his beloved wife, Mrs. Lily Mathis, and the entire family, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Mrs. Maddie B. Clark, who departed this life November 15, 2011. Dedication requested by her beloved children and the entire family, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Mrs. Mary Catherine Applin, who departed this life November 15, 2012. Dedication requested by her beloved son, Mr. Frederick Lewis, and the entire family, gone but not forgotten. Our first selection this morning is dedicated to the following. Happy birthday to Miss Akaya Armstrong, who celebrated her birthday Friday, November 11th. Dedication requested by the Armstrong family. Happy birthday to Mrs. Rosa L. McKenzie, better known to all of us as Miss Pumpkin, who celebrated her birthday Friday, November 11th. Dedication requested by the entire family. Special birthday wishes goes out to Mrs. Faye Green, who will celebrate her birthday Monday, November 14th. Dedication requested by the entire family and all of her members at the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church of Pastor Dr. K.M. Williams, Deacon Tommy Ford, Jr., and the entire membership. All says happy birthday to our own Mrs. Alice Faye Green. God bless you and many, many more. Our first selection this morning is dedicated to the following: Deacon James Smith and family, Mrs. Willie Mae Crapp and family, Mother Willie McGill and family, Mr. Charles Daniels and family, Miss Gail Hardeman and family, Miss Dot Coleman and family, Miss Willie Corbin and family, Judge Gail Sims, retired, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Hardeman and family, Mrs. Alma Johnson and family, Mrs. Loretta Coley and family, Mr. and Mrs. A.B. Levant and family, Mr. and Mrs. Willie B. Barnes and family, Vienna, Georgia, Mr. and Mrs. John Arthur Manning and family, as he remembers his mother, his auntie, Mrs. Thelma Hopper and family, Mother Etna Clay and family, Mother Minnie Fletcher and family, Mrs. Annette Stembridge and family, Mr. Philip Stembridge and family, Deaconess Carrie Brooks and family, Miss Geraldine Pickens and family, Mrs. Minnie Jackson and family, Miss Charlotte West and family, Mrs. Sandra Faye Green and family, the Reverend Lamar and Minister Sharon Thomas and family, Miss Valerie Mercer Ross and family, Mr. Jerome and Miss Maggie Green and family. Mr. and Mrs. Jesse Mercer and family, Miss Annette Putman and family, Mrs. Daphne Henderson and family, Miss Janie Miller and family, Miss Mary Trahan and family, Mrs. Ethel Johnson and family, Mr. and Mrs. Eddie Mae Gaston and family, Mr. A.B. and Miss Valerie Levant and family, Miss Gail Chanel and family, Miss Lakeitha Smith and family, Mrs. Rena Beal and family, Miss Patricia Turner and family, Mrs. Annie Jones and family, Mrs. Carolyn Levant and family, the Reverend Dion and Mrs. Cynthia Jones and family, Mrs. Aletha Askew, church clerk and trustee of the New Oak Grove Baptist Church, Deaconess Connie James and family, Mrs. Dorothy Rose Jones and family, Mrs. Nairobi Levant and family, Mrs. Annie Mae Smith and family, Mrs. Shaquilla Woodson and family, Miss Betty Levant and family, Mrs. Juanita Montfort and family, Miss Jerry Lewis and family, Miss Verdia Butts and family, Mr. Rico Dempsey and family, Mrs. Willie Mae Leary and family of Hatley, Georgia, the entire Leary and Carter family of Hatley, Georgia. Mrs. Shirley Epps and family, Miss Val Carter and family, Miss Sandra Jackson and family, Miss Patricia White and family, Mr. Andrew Jackson and family, Mrs. Barbara Joe Roberts and family, Mr. Derek Carter and family, Miss Connie Passmore and family, Miss Vivian Daniels and family, Mr. Keith Williams and family, Mr. Alvin Williams and family, Missionary Geraldine Perry and family, Mr. Wallace and Mrs. Patty Relaford and family, Miss Vivian Daniels and family, Mrs. Lottie Tarbert and family, the Armstrong family, Miss Esther Armstrong and family, Mrs. Jackie Lattimore and family, Miss Janice Bush and family, Mr. Sean Hutchins and family, Miss Selma Jackson and family, Mr. F.D. Lawton and family, Mr. Lonnie Williams and family, Miss Lois Reynolds and family, Missionary Irene Cantrell and the Reverend Cantrell and family, Miss Bernice Relaford and family, Mrs. Shirley Faye Green and family, the Mobley family, Mrs. Lottie Tarbert and family, the Fullwood family, Missionary Ola Mike and family, Mother Mike Neal and family, Miss Mary Frances Davis and family, Miss Katrina Davis and family, Miss Naisha Davis and family, Miss LaShonda Donaldson and family, Mr. Judson Cober Jr. and family, Miss Thelma Brown and family, Miss Burrow Patrick and family, Miss Mary Tarbert Taylor and family, Miss Nebby Cross and family, Mr. Judge and Miss Tommy Glenn and family, Miss Lavetta Fields and family, Miss Mashonda Holmes and family, Miss Sasha White and family. This first election this morning goes out to my neighbor, Mother Theron Jones and family, and the entire Jones and Tarbert family, Mother Dorothy Tarbert and family, pictures up there. Why you got my pictures up there? Why you got my pictures up there? Our first election this morning goes out to the Reverend Joseph Atkins and family, the Reverend Lorinda Ray and family, and his beloved mother and family, Mrs. Martha West and family, Miss Sheila Thorpe and family, Mr. Samuel McCluster and family, Miss Leon Walken family, the Johnson family, Miss Dorothy Coleman and family, Mr. and Mrs. Julius Deriso and family, Mrs. Julia Turner, Mother Julia Turner and family, Mrs. Murtis Evans and family, Mr. Robert Brown and family, Mr. Willie B. Robinson and family, Mr. Termel Townsend and family, Vienna, Georgia, Mother Evelyn B. Lewis and family. Our first election this morning goes out to Mrs. Juanita Tarbert and family, Deacon Donald Tarbert and family, and thank you for contacting Brother Deacon this morning. Goes out to Deacon and Mrs. John Stubbs and family. Our first election for this morning. It is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcement. Mrs. Janice Patrick Hardison, age 61, of 908 South 8th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, November 9th at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Janice Patrick Hardison, age 61, will be held today, Sunday, November 13th, at 10 a.m. at the A.S. Clark Auditorium on the M.D. White's Medical Institute campus in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Christopher R. Douglas will officiate. The burial will follow at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Miss Gloria Patrick Hughes, age 69, of Griffin, Georgia, died Sunday, November 6th at the Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Gloria Patrick Hughes, age 69, will be held today, Sunday, November 13th at 1 p.m. at the A.S. Clark Auditorium on the campus of the M.D. White's Medical Institute in Cordele, Georgia. Her pastor, the Reverend Cecil Strawder, pastor of the Gethsemane Baptist Church, will officiate. Her beloved cousin, the Reverend Kenneth Tukes Sr., will deliver the eulogy. The burial will follow at the Sunnyside Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. United States Army veteran Mr. Elias Sims III, age 69, of 601 Eastview Drive, Americus, Georgia, died early this morning, Sunday, November 13th, at the Columbus Hospice in Forsyth, Georgia. The funeral service for the United States Army veteran Mr. Elias Sims III, age 69, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangement. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors serving Cordele and Vienna are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Our next and final selection for this morning is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones were laid to rest during the past week. The family of Mr. Jacarian Marquez Hunt of McDonald, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Fannie Mae Maynard Harvey of Warner Robins, Georgia. This selection is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones will be laid to rest during this week. The family of Mrs. Janice Patrick Harcourt of Georgia, the family of Patrick Hughes of Griffin, Georgia, and the family of United States Army veteran Mr. Elias Sims III of Americus, Georgia. This election is dedicated to all of the sick and shut-in, to all patients in the local and surrounding hospitals, nursing homes, and rehabilitation centers, to our beloved ministers and their devoted family members, to all retired teachers, to the men and women serving in armed forces, both stateside and abroad, to all veterans, and to everyone who listens to our program on each Sunday morning. It's a pleasure for us to bring it to you. Our program goes out in memory of our past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams, to my wife, Mrs. Calandra Wilkerson Parker, to my son, Jai Wilkerson Parker. This election goes out to my mother-in-law, Mrs. Billy Ann Hall and family, to my nephew, Deacon Kenneth Smith Jr., program chairman of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church. Goes out to our pastor, Dr. K.M. Williams, his wife, Sister Kathy Williams. Goes out to my cousin, Deacon Emery Wright, and the entire Wright family have all been in Lee County, Georgia, and his members there at the St. Matthew's Baptist Church of Lee County, Georgia. This election goes out to Mr. Cleveland R. Lemon, oldest staff member of the J.W. Williams Funeral Home and steward of the Bethel CME Church here in Cordele, Georgia. This election goes out to our beloved past commissioner, Mr. and Mrs. A.J. Rivers and family. Goes out to Commissioner Vesta, Bill Shepard, and the entire Bill family. This election goes out to our beloved Miss Easter May Sanders and family, to Mr. Simon Felder and family, Mrs. Johnny Bell Sanders and family, the Reverend and Mrs. Keith Lewis and family, Mr. and Mrs. George Reichert and family, Mrs. Joe Blight and family, Vienna, Georgia. Deacon Johnny and Sister Vera Perry and family, Mother Mary Benjamin and family, Mr. Harvey C. and family, Mother Blotty Beal and family, Mrs. Maddie West and family, Mr. and Mrs. John Leroy Perry and family, the Cantrell family, the Hardwick family, Miss Marie Felton and family, Mrs. Bobby Jean Vandrow and family, Mrs. D.W. King and family, Christine Kingdom and family, Mr. and Mrs. Pernell Lately and family, Dr. and Mrs. Thaddeus Lately and family, Miss Dorothy Lamar and family, Deacon Willie C. Kendrick and family, Unadilla, Georgia, the Clee Hoggerbrook family, Mrs. Presenta Woodson and families, Rosa Cooper and families, Lily Mae Perry and family, the Mike Hamilton family of Lilly, Georgia, Mr. and Mrs. Emerson London family, the Granville family, Mrs. Arthur Lawson and family, Mrs. Calvin Baskin Jr. and families, Frank Thomas and families, Molly Williams and family, Mrs. Shirley Jean Taylor and family, Mrs. Evelyn Thomas and family, Miss G. Lundy and family, Mrs. Clyde Mae Dawson and family, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Allman and family, Mr. Randall Lango and family, Mrs. Minnie Jewel Duhart and family, Mr. and Mrs. Wayne Adams and family, Deacon and Mrs. Willie Sutton and family, Mrs. Nanny Lee Burks and family, Mr. Tommy Rogers and family, Mr. and Mrs. Willie Taylor Sr. and family, the Crosby family, Deacon Chester Mike Williams and family, Deacon Vet T. Crane and family, Pinehurst, Georgia, Deacon of the Evergreen Baptist Church of Pinehurst, Georgia, the chairman there, Deacon John David Law and family, Mrs. Maddie Ruth King and family, Deacon Mrs. Bruce Kendrick and family, Mr. Robert Duhart and family, Mrs. Doris Duhart and family, Mrs. Nora Lee Adams and family, Mrs. Osei Outlaw and family, our friend and brother long-standing, the Reverend and Mrs. Johnny B. Dean, pastor of the New Poplar Spring Baptist Church of Byronville, Georgia, Miss Eleanor Ray and family, the Reverend and Mrs. Robbie Williams and family, Mrs. Willie Mae Cobb and family, Mrs. Ernestine Gaines and family, Deacon Major Walker and family, Stuart Lonnie Barrett and family, the entire Barrett family, Miss Linda Butcher and family, Eula Hamilton and family, Mr. Edward Butler and family, Mrs. Carolyn Bolden and family, the entire Bolden and Perry family, Mrs. Anna Rowland family, Mrs. Virginia Williams and family, Mrs. Christine Gaines and family, Mr. Leroy Bass and family, Mr. and Mrs. A.B. Levan and family, Mr. Wayne Foster and family, Mrs. Essie Gay and family, Mrs. Gwendolyn Henderson and family, Mrs. Eddie Mae White and family, Mr. Nicholas Johnson and family, Mother Marie Porter and family, Mrs. Nicholas Johnson and family, Mr. and Mrs. Baracus Johnson and family, Mr. and Mrs. Dwight Johnson and family, Mr. and Mrs. Cedric Johnson and family, Mrs. Vera May and Mr. Arthur James and family, Elder J.C. and Minister Annette Clark and family, Mr. and Mrs. Harry Fox and family, Mr. Robert and Mrs. Fannie Mae Polk and family, Minister Robbie and Mrs. Joanne Williams and family, Mr. James Reedy and and family, Mr. Norris and Mrs. Gail Bembry and family, Mrs. Dolores Lemons and family, Mrs. Nancy Bryant and family, Mr. Joseph Bryant III, the Reverend Jolie Butts and family, Mother Lucinda Ray and family, Mother Grace Patrick and family, Mrs. Rosa Colbert and family, Mrs. Janie Mae Miller and family, Mrs. Alice Mae McKenzie and family, Mrs. B.J. Ezel and family and the staff of BJ's Diner, Mr. Frank Lee Robinson and family, Mr. Lindbergh Smith and family, Mr. Artis Dawson and family, Ms. Barbara Adams and family, Mrs. Virginia Everett and family, Ms. Mattie Pope and family, Mr. Jermaine Harvey and family, Mrs. Charlie Mae Colson and family, Mr. Johnny, Miss Barbara Dennis and family, Ms. Lucille McGill and family, Chairman Deacon Sammy and Mrs. Shanice McGill, Mayor Juanita Kinchin and family of the city of Warwick, Georgia, Deacon George and Mrs. Ann Whitehead and family, Ms. Geraldine Harvey and family, Deacon Eugene and Mrs. Deborah Harvey and family, our final selection for this morning.
Yes, I'm going to walk. Oh, that will keep my way. Oh, child.
Thank you for joining us this morning. We hope you've enjoyed our program. Tune in again on next Sunday morning. And remember, in your time of need, contact the competent, capable, and dependable staff at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home.
Oh, some of these days, well,